He was holding his head in the palms of his hands, the elbows on the open Talmud in front of him, and listening intently. As I continued with my explanation of the thought unit I had just read, I glanced at my wristwatch and discovered to my amazement that I had been talking for almost an hour and a half without interruption. I had to utilize all the commentaries this time, and was able to finish explaining the thought unit a moment before the 3 o'clock bell sounded. Rav Gershenson said nothing. He just sat there and dismissed the class with a wave of his hand. The next day he called on me again, and I continued to read and explain. I spent 2 hours on 7 words, and again, sometime during the session, he sat down, with his head in the palms of his hands. He said not a single word. The bell caught me in the middle of a lengthy explanation of the 4-page commentary, and when he called on me again the 3rd day, I read the 7 words quickly, briefly went through my explanations of the day before, then continued where I had stopped. Between the 3rd and 4th day, my mood jumped back and forth erratically, from wild exhilaration to gloomy apprehension. I knew I was doing well, otherwise Rav Gershenson would have stopped me, but I kept wishing he would say something, and not just stand or sit in complete silence. Some of the Hasidic students in the class were giving me mixed looks of awe and jealousy, as if they couldn't restrain their feelings of admiration over how well I was doing, but at the same time were asking themselves how someone like me, a Zionist and the son of a man who wrote epikorsische articles, could possibly know Talmud so well. Danny, though, seemed absolutely delighted over what was happening. He never looked at me while I read and explained, but I could see him nodding his head and smiling as I went through my explanations. And Rav Gershenson remained silent and impassive, listening intently, his face expressionless, except for an occasional upward curving along the corners of his lips whenever I clarified a particularly difficult point. By the end of the 3rd day, it began to be something of a frustrating experience. I wished he would at least say or do something, nod his head, smile, even catch me at a mistake. Anything but that awful silence. I was prepared for Rav Gershenson to call on me again the 4th day, and he did. There was by now only one more thought unit left in the passage, and I had decided in advance that when I was done explaining, I would quickly review the entire passage and all the commentaries, outlining the difficulties they had found in the text, and showing the different ways they had explained these difficulties. Then I would go into the attempt of the late medieval commentary to reconcile the diverse explanations of the commentaries. All of that took me just under an hour, and when I was satisfied that I had done the best I could, I stopped talking. Rav Gershenson was sitting behind his desk, looking at me intently. It felt strange to me for a moment not to be hearing my own voice anymore, but I had nothing more to say. There was a brief silence, during which I saw one of the Hasidic students grin and lean over to whisper something into another Hasidic student's ear. Then Rav Gershenson got to his feet and folded his arms across his chest. He was smiling a little now, and the upper part of his body was swaying slowly back and forth. He asked me to repeat a point I had made 2 days earlier, and I did. He asked me to make myself a little clearer on a passage in one of the commentaries, and I repeated the passage by heart and explained it again as best I could. He asked me to go over the difficulties I had found in the various commentaries, and I repeated them carefully. Then he asked me to show how the late medieval commentary had attempted to reconcile these difficulties, and I went over that too. Again there was a brief silence. I glanced at my watch and saw it was 2:30. I wondered if he would start on the next passage, with only half an hour left to the shiur. He usually preferred to start a new passage, or inyan, as it is called, at the beginning of a shiur, so as to give the class time to get into it. I was feeling very satisfied with the way I had explained the passage and answered his questions. I promised myself that I would tell my father about it when I visited him in the hospital that evening. Then I heard Rav Gershenson ask me whether I was satisfied with the late medieval commentary's attempt at reconciliation. It was a question I hadn't expected. I had regarded the effort at reconciliation as the rock bottom of the entire discussion on the passage, and had never thought that Rav Gershenson would question it. For a long moment I felt myself wallowing in that dreaded silence that always followed a question of his that a student couldn't answer, and I waited for the drumming of his fingers to begin. But his arms remained folded across his chest, and he stood there, swaying slowly back and forth, looking at me intently. "Nu," he said again. "There are no questions about what he says?" I waited for Danny's hand to go up, but it didn't. I glanced at him and saw his mouth had fallen slightly open. The question had caught him by surprise, too. Rav Gershenson stroked his pointed beard with his right hand, then asked me for the 3rd time if I was satisfied with what the commentary said. I heard myself tell him that I wasn't. "Ah," he said, smiling faintly. "Good. And why not? Because it's Pilpul, I heard myself say. There was a stir from the class. I saw Danny stiffen in his seat, throw me a quick, almost fearful glance, then look away. I was suddenly a little frightened at the disparaging way I had uttered the word Pilpul. The tone of disapproval in my voice hung in the air of the classroom like a threat. Rav Gershenson slowly stroked his pointed gray beard. So, he said softly, it is Pilpul. I see you do not like Pilpul. Nu, the great Vilma Gaon did not like Pilpul. He was talking about Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, the 18th century opponent of Hasidism. Tell me, Reuven, that was the first time he had ever called me by my first name. Why is it Pilpul? What is wrong with his explanation? I answered that it was strained, that it attributed nuances to the various conflicting commentaries that were not there, and that therefore it really was not a reconciliation at all. He nodded his head slowly. Nu, he said, not speaking only to me but to the entire class now. It is a very difficult inyan, and the commentaries, he used the term Rishonim, which indicates the early medieval Talmudic commentators, do not help us. Then he looked at me. Tell me, Reuven, he said quietly, how do you explain the inyan? I sat there and stared at him in stunned silence. If the commentators hadn't been able to explain it, how could I? But he didn't let the silence continue this time. Instead, he repeated his question, his voice soft, gentle. You cannot explain it, Reuven? No, I heard myself say. So, Rev Gershenson said, you cannot explain it. You are sure you cannot explain it? For a moment, I was almost tempted to tell him the text was wrong and to give him the text I had reconstructed. But I didn't. I was afraid. I remembered Danny telling me that Rav Gershenson knew all about the critical method of studying Talmud and hated it, so I kept silent. Rav Gershenson turned to the class. Can anyone explain the inyan? He asked quietly. He was answered by silence. He sighed loudly. No, he said, no one can explain it. The truth is, I cannot explain it myself. It is a difficult inyan, a very difficult inyan. He was silent for a moment, then he shook his head and smiled. A teacher can also sometimes not know, he said softly. That was the first time in my life that I ever heard a rabbi admit that he didn't understand a passage of Talmud. We sat there in an uncomfortable silence. Rav Gershenson stared down at the open Talmud on his desk. Then he closed it slowly and dismissed the class. As I was gathering up my books, I heard him call my name. Danny heard him too and looked at him. I want to talk with you a minute, Rav Gershenson said. I went up to his desk. Standing near him, I could see how wrinkled his face and brow were. The skin on his hands looked dry, parchment-like, and his lips formed a thin line beneath the heavy tangle of gray beard. His eyes were brown and gentle, and deep wrinkles spread from their outside corners like tiny furrows. He waited until all the students were out of the classroom. Then he asked me quietly, You studied the inyan by yourself, Reuven? Yes, I said. Your father did not help you? My father's in the hospital. He looked shocked. He's better now. He had a heart attack. I did not know, he said softly. I am sorry to hear that. He paused for a moment, looking at me intently. So, he said, you studied the inyan alone. I nodded. Tell me, Reuven, he said gently, do you study Talmud with your father? Yes, I said. Your father is a great scholar, he said quietly, almost wistfully. A very great scholar. His brown eyes seemed misty. Reuven, tell me, how would your father have answered my question? I stared at him and didn't know what to say. He smiled faintly, apologetically. You do not know how your father would have explained the inyan? The class was gone. We were alone. And somehow I felt an intimacy between us that made it not too difficult for me to say what I then said. I didn't say it without feeling a little frightened, though. I think I know what he would have said. No, Rav Gershenson prodded me gently. What? I think he would have said that the text is wrong. I saw him blink his eyes a few times, his face expressionless. Explain what you mean, he said quietly. I explained how I had reconstructed the text, and then quoted the reconstructed text from memory, showing him how it fitted perfectly to the explanation offered by the simplest of all the commentaries. I ended by saying I felt certain that it was the text of the Talmud manuscript the commentator had had before him when he had written his commentary. Rav Gershenson was silent for a long moment, his face impassive. Then he said slowly, "You did this by yourself, Reuven?" "Yes." "Your father is a good teacher," he told me quietly. "You are blessed to have such a father." His voice was soft, reverent. "Reuven." "Yes." "I must ask you never to use such a method of explanation in my class." He was speaking gently, almost apologetically. "I am myself not opposed to such a method, but I must ask you never to use it in my class. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "I will call on you often now," he said, smiling warmly. "Now that you understand, I will call on you very often. I've been waiting all year to see how good a teacher your father is. He's a great teacher and a great scholar. It is a joy to listen to you. But you must not use this method in my class. You understand?" "Yes," I said again. And he dismissed me with a quiet smile and a gentle nod of his head. That evening, after my last class, I went to the school library and looked for Rav Gershenson's name in the Hebrew and English catalogs. His name wasn't listed anywhere. It was then that I understood why my father was not teaching in this school. Chapter 15. My father returned from the hospital in the middle of March. He was weak and gaunt, confined to his bed, and almost completely incapable of any kind of physical activity. Manya cared for him as though he were a child, and Dr. Grossman visited him twice a week, on Mondays and Thursdays, until the end of April, when the visits were reduced to once a week. He was satisfied with my father's progress, he kept telling me. There was nothing to worry about anymore, except to make sure that he had complete rest. During the first 4 weeks my father was home, a night nurse came in every evening, stayed awake through the night in my father's room, then left in the morning. Talking tired him quickly. Even listening seemed to tire him. We weren't able to spend too much time together the first 6 weeks he was home, but it was wonderful to have him there, to know he was back in his room again and out of the hospital, and to know that the dark silence was finally gone from the apartment. I had told him about my experience with Rav Gershenson while he had still been in the hospital. He had listened quietly, nodded, and had said he was very proud of me. He hadn't said anything at all about Rav Gershenson. I was being called on regularly now in the Talmud class, and there were no silences when I read and explained a passage. I saw Danny all the time in school, but the silence between us continued. I had finally come to accept it. We had begun to communicate with our eyes, with nods of our heads, with gestures of our hands, but we did not speak to each other. I had no idea how he was getting along in psychology or how his family was, but I heard no bad news, so I assumed things were more or less all right. The grim faces of the teachers and students in school reflected the newspaper headlines that told of Arab riots and attacks against the Jews of Palestine, Jewish defense measures, many of which were being hampered by the British, and continued Irgun activities. The Arabs were attacking Jewish settlements in the Upper Galilee, the Negev, and around Jerusalem, and were incessantly harassing supply convoys. Arabs were killing Jews, Jews were killing Arabs, and the British, caught uncomfortably in the middle, seemed unable and at times even unwilling to stop the rising tide of slaughter. The Zionist youth groups in the school became increasingly active, and on one occasion some of the members of my group were asked to cut our afternoon classes and go down to a warehouse in Brooklyn to help load uniforms, helmets, and canteens onto huge 10-ton trucks that were waiting outside. We were told that the supplies would soon be on a ship heading for Palestine and would be used by the Haganah. We worked long and hard, and somehow loading these trucks made me feel intimately bound up with the news bulletins that I kept hearing on the radio and seeing in the papers. In April, Tiberias, Haifa, and Safed were occupied by the Haganah, and the Irgun, with the help of the Haganah, captured Jaffa. My father was a good deal stronger now, and had begun walking a bit inside the house. We were able to talk at length, and we talked of little else but Palestine. He told me that before his heart attack, he had been asked to go as a delegate to the Zionist General Council that was to meet in Palestine during the coming summer. "Now I will be glad if I can go to the cottage this summer," he said, and there was a wry smile on his lips. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked him. "I did not want to upset you, but I could not keep it to myself any longer, so I'm telling you now." "Why didn't you tell me when they asked you?" "They asked me the night I had the attack," he said. We never talked about it again, but if I was around, I always knew when he thought about it. His eyes would become dreamy, and he would sigh and shake his head. He had worked so hard for a Jewish state, and that very work now kept him from seeing it. I wondered often during the coming months what meaning he could possibly give to that. I didn't know, and I didn't ask. We wept quite openly that Friday in the second week of May when Israel was born, and on my way to the synagogue the next morning, I saw the newspaper headlines announcing the birth of the Jewish state. They also announced that the Arab armies had begun their threatened invasion. The next few weeks were black and ugly. The Etzion area in the Hebron Mountains fell. The Jordanian army attacked Jerusalem. The Iraqi army invaded the Jordan Valley. The Egyptian army invaded the Negev. And the battle for Latron, the decisive point along the road to Jerusalem, turned into a bloodbath. My father became grim and silent, and I began to worry again about his health. In early June, a rumor swept through the school that a recent graduate had been killed in the fighting around Jerusalem. The rumor ran wild for a few days and was finally confirmed. I hadn't known him at all. He had been graduated before I had entered, but apparently most of the present members of the senior class remembered him well. He had been a brilliant mathematics student and very popular. He had gone to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem to get his doctorate, had joined the Haganah, and been killed trying to get a convoy through to Jerusalem. We were stunned. We had never thought the war would come so close. On a day in the second week of June, the same week the United Nations truce went into effect and the fighting in Israel ceased, the entire school attended an assembly in memory of the student. Everyone was there, every rabbi, student, and college teacher. One of his Talmud teachers described his devoutness and dedication to Judaism. His mathematics professor talked about his brilliance as a student, and one of the members of the senior class told of the way he had always spoken of going to Israel. Then we all stood as a prayer was chanted, and the Kaddish was said. Reb Saunders' Anti-Zionist League died that day as far as the students in Hirsch College were concerned. It remained alive outside the school, but I never again saw an anti-Zionist leaflet inside the school building. The final examinations were not too much of a problem to me that semester, and I made all A's. July came and brought sweltering heat, and a happy announcement from Dr. Grossman that my father was now well enough to be able to go to the cottage in August and resume teaching in September. But he was to rest in the cottage, not work. Yes, he could write, since when was writing work? My father laughed at that, the first time he had laughed in months. In September, my father resumed his teaching, and I entered my third year of college. Since symbolic logic was part of philosophy, I had chosen philosophy as my major subject and was finding it very exciting. The weeks passed quickly. My father was doing nothing but teaching for the first few months. Then, with the approval of Dr. Grossman, he went back to some of his Zionist activities and to teaching an adult class one night a week. The war in Israel continued sporadically, especially in the Negev, but the initiative had passed to the Israelis, and the tension was gone from it by now. Reb Saunders' Anti-Zionist League seemed to have gone out of existence. I heard nothing about it, even in my own neighborhood. And one day in the late spring of that year, while I was eating lunch, Danny came over to my table, smiled hesitantly, sat down, and asked me to give him a hand with his experimental psychology. He was having difficulty setting up a graph for a formula involving variables. Chapter 16. I felt a little shiver hearing his voice. "Welcome back to the land of the living," I said, staring up at him and feeling my heart turn over. It had been over 2 years now that we hadn't talked to each other. He smiled faintly and rubbed his beard, which was quite thick. He was wearing his usual dark suit, tieless shirt, fringes, and skullcap. His earlocks hung down along the sides of his sculptured face, and his eyes were bright and very blue. "The ban has been lifted," he said simply. "It feels good to be kosher again," I told him, not without some bitterness in my voice. He blinked his eyes and tried another smile. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, too. I needed you around for a while, especially when my father was sick." He nodded, and his eyes were sad. "How do you do it?" I asked. He blinked again. "Do what?" "How do you take the silence?" He didn't say anything, but his face tightened. "I hated it," I told him. "How do you take it?" He pulled nervously at an earlock, his eyes dark and brooding. "I think I would lose my mind," I said. "No, you wouldn't," he said softly. "You'd learn to live with it." "Why does he do it?" The hand pulling at the earlock dropped down to the table. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know. We still don't talk. Except when you study Talmud or he explodes." He nodded soberly. "I hate to tell you what I think of your father." He's a great man, Danny said evenly. He must have a reason. I think it's crazy and sadistic, I said bitterly, and I don't like your father at all. You're entitled to your opinion, Danny said softly, and I'm entitled to mine. We were silent for a moment. You've lost weight, I told him. He nodded but remained silent. He sat there slumped over, looking small and uncomfortable, like a bird in pain. How are your eyes? I asked. He shrugged. They bother me sometimes. The doctor says it's nervous tension. There was another silence. It's good to have you back, I said, and I grinned. He smiled hesitantly, his blue eyes bright and shining. You and your crazy way of hitting a baseball, I said. You and your father with his crazy silences and explosions. He smiled again, deeply now, and straightened up in the chair. Will you help me with this graph? He asked. I told him it was about time he helped himself with graphs, and then showed him what to do. When I told my father about it that night, he nodded soberly. He had expected it, he said. The Jewish state was not an issue anymore, but a fact. How long would Reb Saunders have continued his ban over a dead issue? How is Danny feeling? He wanted to know. I told him Danny didn't look well and had lost a lot of weight. He was thoughtful for a moment. Then he said, Reuven, the silence between Danny and Reb Saunders, it is continuing? Yes. His face was sad. A father can bring up a child any way he wishes, he said softly. What a price to pay for a soul. When I asked him what he meant, he wouldn't say anything more about it, but his eyes were dark. So, Danny and I resumed our old habits of meeting in front of my synagogue, of riding to school together, eating lunch together, and going home together. Rev Gershenson's class became a particular joy because the ease between Danny and myself now permitted us to engage in a constant flow of competitive discussion that virtually monopolized the hours of the shiur. We dominated the class to such an extent that one day, after a particularly heated Talmudic battle between Danny and me that had gone on uninterrupted for almost a quarter of an hour, Rav Gershenson stopped us and pointed out that this wasn't a private lesson he was giving. There were 12 other students in the class. Didn't anyone else have something to say? But he said it with a warm smile, and Danny and I were delighted by his oblique compliment. A few days after we had resumed talking, Danny told me that he had resigned himself to experimental psychology, and was even beginning to enjoy it. When he talked about psychology now, he invariably used the technical language of the experimentalist. Variables, constants, manipulation, observation, recording of data, testing hypotheses, and the advantages of attempting to refute hypotheses as against confirming them. Mathematics no longer seemed to be much of a problem to him. Only rarely now did he need my help. We were sitting in the lunchroom one day when he told me of a conversation he had had with Professor Appelman. He said if I ever wanted to make any kind of valuable contribution to psychology, I would have to use scientific method. The Freudian approach doesn't really provide a method of accepting or rejecting hypotheses, and that's no way to acquire knowledge. Well, well, I grinned. Goodbye, Freud. He shook his head. No, it's not goodbye, Freud. Freud was a genius, but he was too circumspect in his findings. I want to know a lot more than just the things Freud dealt with. Freud never really did anything with perception, for example, or with learning. How people see, hear, touch, smell, taste, and learn is a fascinating subject. Freud never went into any of that. He was a genius, all right, in what he did go into. You're going to become an experimentalist? I don't think so. I want to work with people, not with rats and mazes. I talked to Appelman about it. He suggested I go into clinical psychology. What's that? Well, it's the same as the difference between theoretical and applied physics, say. The experimental psychologist is more or less the theoretician. The clinical psychologist applies what the experimentalist learns. He gets to work with people. He examines them, tests them, diagnoses them, even treats them. What do you mean, treats them? He does therapy. You're going to become an analyst? Maybe. But psychoanalysis is only one form of therapy. There are many other kinds. What kinds? Oh, many kinds, he said vaguely. A lot of it is still very experimental. You're planning to experiment on people? I don't know. Maybe. I really don't know too much about it yet. Are you going on for a doctorate? Sure. You can't move in this field without a doctorate. Where are you planning to go? I don't know yet. Appelman suggested Columbia. That's where he got his doctorate. Does your father know yet? Danny gave me a tight, strained look. "No," he said quietly. "When will you tell him?" "The day I receive my shmika." Shmika is the Hebrew term for rabbinic ordination. "That's next year," I said. Danny nodded grimly. Then he looked at his watch. "We better move or we'll be late for the shiur," he said. We raced up the stairs to Rav Gershonson's class and made it just a moment before he called on someone to read and explain. During another one of our lunchroom conversations, Danny asked me what good symbolic logic was going to be for me when I entered the rabbinate. I told him I didn't know, but I was doing a lot of reading in philosophy and theology, and some good might come of that. "I always thought that logic and theology were like David and Saul," Danny said. "They are, but it might help them get better acquainted." He shook his head. "I can't get over your becoming a rabbi. I can't get over your becoming a psychologist." And we looked at each other in quiet wonder. In June, Danny's sister was married. I was invited to the wedding, and was the only one there who wasn't a Hasid. It was a traditionally Hasidic wedding, with the men and women sitting separately, and a lot of dancing and singing. I was shocked when I saw Reb Saunders. His black beard had begun to go gray, and he seemed to have aged a great deal since I had seen him last. I went over to congratulate him, and he shook my hand warmly, his eyes dark and piercing. He was surrounded by people, and we didn't have a chance to talk. I didn't care. I wasn't particularly eager to talk to him. Levi had grown up a little, but he still looked white-skinned, and his eyes still seemed large behind his shell-rimmed glasses. Danny's sister had become a beautiful girl. The boy she married was a Hasid, with a black beard, long earlocks, and dark eyes. He looked rather severe, and I quickly decided I didn't like him. When I congratulated him after the wedding and shook his hand, his fingertips were limp and moist. When the school year ended and July came around, I went over to Danny's house one morning. Except for the wedding, I hadn't seen Reb Saunders at all since Danny and I had begun talking again, because my father was teaching me Talmud on Shabbat afternoons. So I decided it would be the polite thing to do to go over one morning after the school year. Danny took me up to his father's study. The third-floor hallway was crowded with dark caftaned men, waiting around in silence to see his father. They nodded and murmured respectful greetings to Danny, and one of them, an incredibly old man with a white beard and a bent body, reached out and touched his arm as we passed. I found the gesture distasteful. I was beginning to find everything connected with Reb Saunders and Hasidism distasteful. We waited until the person who was with his father came out, then went in. Reb Saunders sat in his straight-backed red leather chair, surrounded by books and the musty odor of old bindings. His face seemed lined with pain, but his voice was soft when he greeted me. He was, he said quietly, very happy to see me. He hesitated, looked at me, then at Danny. His eyes were dark and brooding. Where was I keeping myself, he asked, and why wasn't I coming over any more on Shabbos afternoons? I told him my father and I were studying Talmud together on Shabbat. His eyes brooded, and he sighed. He nodded vaguely. He wished he could spend more time talking to me now, he said, but there were so many people who needed to see him. Couldn't I come over some Shabbos afternoon? I told him I would try, and Danny and I went out. That was all he said. Not a word about Zionism. Not a word about the silence he had imposed upon Danny and me. Nothing. I found I disliked him more when I left than when I had entered. I did not see him again that July. Chapter 17. Our last year of college began that September. Over lunch one day, I told Danny a mild anti-Hasidic story I had heard, and he laughed loudly. Then, without thinking, I mentioned a remark one of the students had made a few days back, that Tzaddik sits in absolute silence, saying nothing, and all his followers listened attentively. And the laughter left his lips as suddenly as if he'd been slapped, and his face froze. I realized suddenly what I had said, and felt myself go cold. I muttered a helpless apology. For a long moment he said nothing. His eyes seemed glazed, turned inward. Then his face slowly relaxed. He smiled faintly. "There's more truth to that than you realize," he murmured. "You can listen to silence, Reuben. I've begun to realize that you can listen to silence and learn from it. It has a quality and a dimension all its own. It talks to me sometimes. I feel myself alive in it. It talks, and I can hear it." The words came out in a soft sing-song. He sounded exactly like his father. "You don't understand that, do you?" he asked. "No." He nodded. "I didn't think you would." "What do you mean it talks to you?" You have to want to listen to it, and then you can hear it. It has a strange, beautiful texture. It doesn't always talk. Sometimes it cries, and you can hear the pain of the world in it. It hurts to listen to it then, but you have to. I felt myself go cold again, hearing him talk that way. I don't understand that at all. He smiled faintly. Are you and your father talking these days? He shook his head. I didn't understand any of it, but he seemed so somber and strange that I didn't want to talk about it any more. I changed the subject. You ought to get yourself a girl, I told him. I was dating regularly now on Saturday nights. It's a wonderful tonic for a suffering soul. He looked at me, his eyes sad. My wife has been chosen for me, he said quietly. I gaped at him. It's an old Hasidic custom, remember? It never occurred to me, I said, shocked. He nodded soberly. That's another reason it won't be so easy to break out of the trap. It doesn't only involve my own family. I didn't know what to say. There was a long, uncomfortable silence, and we walked together in that silence to Rav Gershensen's shiur. Danny's brother's bar mitzvah celebration, which I attended on a Monday morning during the third week in October, was a simple, unpretentious affair. The morning service began at 7:30, early enough to enable Danny and me to attend and not come late to school, and Levi was called to recite the blessing over the Torah. After the service, there was a kiddush, consisting of schnapps and some cakes and cookies. Everyone drank l'chaim, to life, then left. Reb Saunders asked me quietly why I wasn't coming over to see him anymore, and I explained that my father and I were studying Talmud together on Shabbat afternoons. He nodded vaguely and walked slowly away, his tall frame somewhat stooped. Levi Saunders was now tall and thin. He seemed a ghostly imitation of Danny, except that his hair was black and his eyes were dark. The skin on his hands and face was milky white, almost translucent, showing the branching veins. There was something helplessly fragile about him. He looked as if a wind would blow him down. Yet at the same time his dark eyes burned with a kind of inner fire that told of the tenacity with which he clung to life, and of his growing awareness of the truth that for the rest of his days his every breath would depend upon the pills he put into his mouth at regular intervals. His eyes told you that he had every intention of holding on to his life, no matter what the pain. As if to emphasize the tenuousness of Levi Saunders' existence, he became violently ill the day following his bar mitzvah and was taken by ambulance to the Brooklyn Memorial Hospital. Danny called me during supper as soon as the ambulance pulled away from in front of his house, and I could tell from his voice that he was in a panic. There wasn't much I could say to him over the phone, and when I asked him if he wanted me to come over, he said no. His mother was almost hysterical. He would have to stay with her. He had only wanted to let me know, and he hung up. My father apparently had heard my troubled voice, because he was standing now outside the kitchen, asking me what was wrong. I told him. We resumed our supper. I wasn't very hungry now, but I ate anyway to keep Manya happy. My father noticed how disturbed I was, but he said nothing. After the meal, he followed me into my room, sat on my bed while I sat at my desk, and asked me what was wrong. Why was I so upset by Levi Saunders' illness? He had been ill before. It was at this point that I told my father of Danny's plans to go on for a doctorate in psychology, and abandon the position of tzaddik he was to inherit one day from Rev Saunders. I also added, feeling that I ought to be completely honest about it now, that Danny was in a panic over his brother's illness, because without his brother it might not be possible for him to break away from his father. He did not really want to destroy the dynasty. My father's face became more and more grim as he listened. When I was done, he sat for a long time in silence, his eyes grave. "When did Danny tell you this?" he asked finally. "The summer I lived in their house." "That long ago. He knew already that long ago?" "Yes." "And all this time you did not tell me?" "It was a secret between us, Abba." He looked at me grimly. "Does Danny know what pain this will cause his father?" "He dreads the day he'll have to tell him. He dreads it for both of them." "I knew it would happen," my father said. "How could it not happen?" Then he looked at me sharply. "Reuven, let me understand this. Exactly what is Danny planning to tell Reb Saunders? That he's going on for a doctorate in psychology and doesn't intend to take his place. Is Danny thinking to abandon his Judaism?" I stared at him. "I never thought to ask him," I said faintly. "His beard, his earlocks, his clothes, his fringes, All this he will retain in graduate school? I don't know, Abba. We never talked about it. Reuven, how will Danny become a psychologist while looking like a Hasid? I didn't know what to say. It is important that Danny know exactly what he will tell his father. He must anticipate what questions will be on Reb Saunders' mind. Talk to Danny. Let him think through exactly what he will tell his father. All this time I never thought to ask him. Danny is now like a person waiting to be let out of jail. He has only one desire, to leave the jail, despite what may be waiting for him outside. Danny cannot think 1 minute beyond the moment he will have to tell his father he does not wish to take his place. Do you understand me? Yes. You will talk to him? Of course. My father nodded grimly, his face troubled. I have not talked to Danny in so long, he said quietly. He was silent for a moment, then he smiled faintly. It is not so easy to be a friend, is it, Reuven? No, I said. Tell me, Danny and Reb Saunders still do not talk? I shook my head. Then I told him what Danny had said about silence. What does it mean to hear silence, Abba? That seemed to upset him more than the news about Danny not becoming a tzaddik. He sat up straight on the bed, his body quivering. Hasidim, I heard him mutter, almost contemptuously. Why must they feel the burden of the world is only on their shoulders? I looked at him, puzzled. I had never heard that tone of contempt in his voice before. It is a way of bringing up children, he said. What is? Silence. I don't understand. I cannot explain it. I do not understand it completely myself. But what I know of it, I dislike. It was practiced in Europe by some few Hasidic families. Then his voice went hard. There are better ways to teach a child compassion. I don't... He cut me short. Reuven, I cannot explain what I do not understand. Danny is being raised by Reb Saunders in a certain way. I do not want to talk about it any more. It upsets me. You will speak to Danny, yes? I nodded. Now I have work I must do. And he went from the room, leaving me as bewildered as I had been before. I had planned to talk to Danny the next day, but when I saw him, he was in such a state of panic over his brother that I didn't dare mention what my father had said. The doctors had diagnosed his brother's illness as some kind of imbalance in the blood chemistry caused by something he had eaten, Danny told me over lunch, looking pale and grim and blinking his eyes repeatedly. They were trying out some new pills, and his brother would remain in the hospital until they were certain the pills worked, and he would have to be very careful from now on with his diet. Danny was tense and miserable all that day, and throughout the week. Levi Saunders was discharged from the Brooklyn Memorial Hospital the following Wednesday afternoon. I saw Danny in school the next day. We sat in the lunchroom and ate for a while in silence. His brother was fine, he said finally, and everything seemed to have settled down. His mother was in bed with high blood pressure, though, but the doctor said it was caused by her excitement over Levi's illness, and all she needed now was to rest. She would be better soon. He told me quietly that he was planning to write 3 universities that day, Harvard, Berkeley, and Columbia, and apply for a fellowship in psychology. I asked him how long he thought he would be able to keep his applications a secret. I don't know, he said, his voice a little tight. Why don't you tell your father now and get it over with? He looked at me, his face grim. I don't want explosions with every meal, he said tightly. All I get are either explosions or silence. I've had enough of his explosions. Then I told him what my father had said. As I spoke, I could see him become more and more uncomfortable. I didn't want you to tell your father, he muttered angrily. My father kept your library visits a secret from me, I reminded him. Don't worry about my father. I don't want you to tell anyone else. I won't. What about what my father said? Are you going to remain an Orthodox Jew? Whatever gave you the notion that I had any intention of not remaining an Orthodox Jew? What if your father asks about the beard, the kaftan, He won't ask me. What if he does? He pulled nervously at an earlock. Can you see me practicing psychology and looking like a Hasid? He said tightly. I hadn't really expected any other answer. Then something occurred to me. Won't your father see the mail you get from the graduate schools you've applied to? He stared at me. I never thought of that, he said slowly. I'll have to intercept the mail. He hesitated, his face rigid. I can't. It comes after I leave for school. And his eyes filled with fear. I think you ought to have a talk with my father, I said. Danny came over to our apartment that night, and I took him into my father's study. My father came quickly around from behind his desk and shook Danny's hand. "I have not seen you in such a long time," he said, smiling warmly. "It is good to see you again, Danny. Please sit down." My father did not sit behind his desk. He sat next to us on the kitchen chair he had asked me earlier to bring into the study. "Do not be angry at Reuven for telling me," he said quietly to Danny. "I have had practice with keeping secrets." Danny smiled nervously. "You will tell your father on the day of your ordination?" Danny nodded. "Is there a girl involved?" Danny nodded again, giving me a momentary glance. "You will refuse to marry this girl?" "Yes." "And your father will have to explain to her parents and to his followers." Danny was silent, his face tight. My father sighed softly. "It will be a very uncomfortable situation, for you and for your father. Are you determined not to take your father's place?" "Yes," Danny said. "Then you must know exactly what you will tell him. Think carefully of what you will say. Think what your father's questions will be. Think what he will be most concerned about after he hears of your decision. Do you understand me, Danny?" Danny nodded slowly. There was a long silence. Then my father leaned forward in his chair. "Danny," he said softly, "you can hear silence?" Danny looked at him, startled. His blue eyes were wide, frightened. He glanced at me. Then he looked again at my father, and slowly he nodded his head. "You are not angry at your father?" Danny shook his head. "Do you understand what he is doing?" Danny hesitated. Then he shook his head again. His eyes were wide and moist. My father sighed again. "It will be explained to you," he said softly. "Your father will explain it to you, because he will want you to carry it on with your own children one day." Danny blinked his eyes nervously. "No one can help you with this, Danny. It is between you and your father. But think carefully of what you will say to him, and of what his questions will be." My father came with us to the door of our apartment. I could hear Danny's capped shoes tapping against the outside hallway floor. Then he was gone. "What's this again about hearing silence, Abba?" I asked. But my father would say nothing. He went into his study and closed the door. Danny received letters of acceptance from each of the 3 universities to which he had applied. The letters came in the mail to his home and lay untouched on the vestibule table until he returned from school. He told me about it in early January, a day after the 3rd letter had come. I asked him who usually picked up the mail. "My father," he said, looking tense and bewildered. "Levi's in school when it comes, and my mother doesn't like climbing stairs." "Were there return addresses on the envelopes?" "Of course." "Then how can't he know?" I asked him. "I don't understand it," he said, his voice edged with panic. "What is he waiting for? Why doesn't he say something?" I felt sick with his fear, and said nothing. Danny told me a few days later that his sister was pregnant. She and her husband had been over to the house and had informed his parents. His father had smiled for the first time since Levi's bar mitzvah, Danny said, and his mother had wept with joy. I asked him if his father gave any indication at all of knowing what his plans were. "No," he said. "No indication at all?" "No. I get nothing from him but silence." "Is he silent with Levi, too?" "No." "Was he silent with your sister?" "No." "I don't like your father," I told him. "I don't like him at all." Danny said nothing, but his eyes blinked his fear. A few days later he told me, "My father asked me why you're not coming over on Shabbat." "He talked to you?" "He didn't talk. That isn't talking. I study Talmud on Shabbat." "I know. I'm not too eager to see him." He nodded unhappily. "Have you decided which university you're going to?" "Columbia." "Why don't you tell him and get it over with?" "I'm afraid." "What difference does it make? If he's going to throw you out of the house, he'll do it no matter when you tell him." "What difference does it make? If he's going to throw you out of the house, he'll do it no matter when you tell him." "I'll have my degree in June. I'll be ordained." "You can live with us." "No, you can't. You won't eat at our house." "I could live with my sister." "Yes." "I'm afraid. I'm afraid of the explosion. I'm afraid of any time I'll have to tell him. God, I'm afraid." My father would say nothing when I talked to him about it. "It is for Reb Saunders to explain," he told me quietly. I cannot explain what I do not completely understand. I cannot do it with my students, and I cannot do it with my son." A few days later, Danny told me that his father had asked again why I wasn't coming over to their house anymore. "I'll try to get over," I said. But I didn't try very hard. I didn't want to see Reb Saunders. I hated him as much now as I had when he had forced his silence between me and Danny. The weeks passed, and winter melted slowly into spring. Danny was working on an experimental psychology project that had to do with the relationship between reinforcement and rapidity of learning, and I was doing a long paper on the logic of ought statements. Danny pushed himself relentlessly in his work. He grew thin and gaunt, and the angles and bones of his face and hands jutted like sharp peaks from beneath his skin. He stopped talking about the silence between him and his father. He seemed to be shouting down the silence with his work. Only his constantly blinking eyes gave any indication of his mounting terror. The day before the start of the Passover school vacation period, he told me that his father had asked him once again why I wasn't coming over to their house anymore. Could I possibly come over on Passover, he had wanted to know. He especially wanted to see me the first or second day of Passover. "I'll try," I said half-heartedly, without the slightest intention of trying at all. But when I talked to my father that night, he said, with a strange sharpness in his voice, "You did not tell me Reb Saunders has been asking to see you. He's been asking all along. Reuven, when someone asks to speak to you, you must let him speak to you. You still have not learned that? You did not learn that from what happened between you and Danny?" "He wants to study Talmud, Abba." "You are sure? That's all we've ever done when I go over there. You only study Talmud? Have you forgotten so quickly?" I stared at him. "He wants to talk to me about Danny," I said, and felt myself turn cold. "You will go over the first day of the holiday, on Sunday." Why didn't he tell me? "Reuven, he did tell you. You have not been listening. All these weeks. Listen next time. Listen when someone speaks to you." Maybe I should go over tonight." "No, they will be busy preparing for the holiday. I'll go over on Shabbat." "Reb Saunders asked you to come on Passover." "I told him we study Talmud on Shabbat." "You will go on Passover. He has his reason if he asked you to come especially on Passover. And listen next time when someone speaks to you, Reuven." He was angry, as angry as he had been in the hospital years ago when I had refused to talk to Danny. I called Danny and told him I would be over on Sunday. He sensed something in my voice. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I'll see you on Sunday." "Nothing's wrong?" His voice was tight, apprehensive. "No. Come over around 4, he said. "My father needs to rest in the early afternoons." 4. "Nothing's wrong?" "I'll see you on Sunday," I told him. Chapter 18. On the afternoon of the first day of Passover, I walked beneath the early spring sycamores on my street, then turned into Lee Avenue. The sun was warm and bright, and I went along slowly, past the houses and the shops and the synagogue, where my father and I prayed. I met one of my classmates, and we stopped to talk for a few minutes. Then I went on alone, turning finally into Danny Street. The sycamores formed a tangled bower through which the sun shone brightly, speckling the ground. There were tiny buds on these sycamores now, and on some I could see the green shoots of infant leaves. In a month, those leaves would shut out the sky. But now the sun came through and brushed streaks of gold across the sidewalks, the street, the talking women, and the playing children. I walked along slowly, remembering the first time I had gone up this street years ago. Those years were coming to an end now. In 3 months, in a time when the leaves would be fat and full, our lives would separate like the branches overhead that made their own way into the sunlight. I went slowly up the wide stone staircase of Danny's house and through the wooden double door of the entrance. The hallway was dim and cold. The synagogue door stood open. I peered inside. Its emptiness whispered echoes at me. Mistakes, gematria, Talmud quizzes, and Reb Saunders staring at my left eye. "You do not know yet what it is to be a friend." "Scientific criticism, ah. Your father is an observer of the commandments. It is not easy to be a true friend." Soft, silent echoes. It seemed tiny to me now, the synagogue, so much less neat than when I had seen it for the first time. The stands were scarred, the walls needed paint, the naked light bulbs seemed ugly, their bare black wires like the dead branches of a stunted tree. What echoes will Reb Saunders' study have, I thought, and I felt myself go tight with apprehension. I stood at the door of the inner stairway and called Danny's name. My voice moved heavily through the silent house. I waited a moment, then called his name again. I heard the tapping of metal-capped shoes on the third-floor stairway, then in the hallway over my head, and then Danny was standing at the head of the stairs, tall, gaunt, an almost spectral figure with his beard and earlocks and black satin caftan. I climbed the stairs slowly, and he greeted me. He looked tired. His mother was resting, he said, and his brother was out somewhere. He and his father were studying Talmud. His voice was dull, flat, only faintly edged with fear, but his eyes mirrored clearly what his voice concealed. We went up to the third floor. Danny seemed to hesitate before the door to his father's study, almost as if he was wishing not to have to go back in there again. Then he opened the door and we stepped inside. It had been almost a year since I had last been inside Reb Saunders' study, but nothing about it had changed. There was the same massive black wood glass-topped desk, the same red carpet, the same glass-enclosed wooden bookcases jammed tight with books, the same musty old book odor in the air, the same single light bulb glowing white behind its ceiling fixture. Nothing had really changed. Nothing except Reb Saunders himself. He sat in his straight-backed, red-leather chair and looked at me from behind the desk. His beard had gone almost completely gray, and he sat stooped forward, bent, as though he were carrying something on his shoulders. His brow was crisscrossed with wrinkles, his dark eyes brooded and burned with some kind of invisible suffering, and the fingers of his right hand played aimlessly with a long gray earlock. He greeted me quietly, but did not offer me his hand. I had the feeling that a handshake was a physical effort he wanted to avoid. Danny and I sat in the chairs by his desk, Danny to his right, I to his left. Danny's face was expressionless, closed. He tugged nervously at an earlock. Reb Saunders moved forward slightly in the chair and put his hands on the desk. Slowly he closed the Talmud from which he and Danny had been studying. Then he sighed, a deep, trembling sigh that filled the silence of the room like a wind. "Nu, Reuven," he said quietly. Finally you come to see me." He spoke in Yiddish, his voice quavering a little as the words came out. "I apologize," I said hesitantly in English. He nodded his head, and his right hand went up and stroked his gray beard. "You have become a man," he said quietly. "The first day you sat here, you were only a boy. Now you are a man." Danny seemed suddenly to become conscious of the way he was twisting his earlock. He put his hand on his lap, clasped both hands tightly together, and sat very still, staring at his father. Reb Saunders looked at me and smiled feebly, nodding his head. "My son Daniel has also become a man. It is a great joy for a father to see his son suddenly a man." Danny stirred faintly in his chair, then was still. "What will you do after your graduation?" Reb Saunders asked quietly. "I have another year to study for smicha." "And then what?" "I'm going into the rabbinate." He looked at me and blinked his eyes. I thought I saw him stiffen for a moment, as though in sudden pain. "You're going to become a rabbi," he murmured, speaking more to himself than to me. He was silent for a moment. "Yes, I remember. Yes." He sighed again and shook his head slowly, the gray beard moving back and forth. "My Daniel will receive his smicha in June," he said quietly. Then he added, "In June, yes, his smicha, yes." The words trailed off, aimless, disconnected, and hung in the air for a long moment of tight silence. Then slowly he moved his right hand across the closed Talmud, and his fingers caressed the Hebrew title of the tractate that was stamped into the spine of the binding. Then he clasped both hands together and rested them on top of the Talmud. His body followed the movements of his hands, and his gray earlocks moved along the sides of his aged face. "Nu," he said, speaking softly, so softly I could barely hear him. "In June, my Daniel and his good friend begin to go different ways. They are men, not children, and men go different ways. You will go one way, Reuven, and my son, my Daniel, he will go another way." I saw Danny's mouth fall open. His body gave a single convulsive shudder. Different ways, I thought. Different ways. Then he... "I know," Reb Saunders murmured, as if he were reading my mind. "I have known it for a long time." Danny let out a soft, half-choked, trembling moan. Reb Saunders did not look at him. He had not looked at him once. He was talking to Danny through me. "Reuben, I want you to listen carefully to what I will tell you now." He had said Reuben. His eyes had said Danny. "You will not understand it. You may never understand it. And you may never stop hating me for what I have done. I know how you feel. I do not see it in your eyes, but I want you to listen. A man is born into this world with only a tiny spark of goodness in him. The spark is God. It is the soul. The rest is ugliness and evil, a shell. The spark must be guarded like a treasure. It must be nurtured. It must be fanned into a flame. It must learn to seek out other sparks. It must dominate the shell. Anything can be a shell, Reuben. Anything. Indifference, laziness, brutality, and genius. Yes, even a great mind can be a shell and choke the spark. Reuben, the master of the universe, blessed me with a brilliant son, and he cursed me with all the problems of raising him. Ah, what it is to have a brilliant son. Not a smart son, Reuben, but a brilliant one. A Daniel, a boy with a mind like a jewel. Ah, what a curse it is, what an anguish it is to have a Daniel whose mind is like a pearl, like a sun. Reuben, when my Daniel was 4 years old, I saw him reading a story from a book, and I was frightened. He did not read the story. He swallowed it, as one swallows food or water. There was no soul in my 4-year-old Daniel. There was only his mind. He was a mind in a body without a soul. It was a story in a Yiddish book about a poor Jew and his struggles to get to Eretz Yisroel before he died. Ah, how that man suffered. And my Daniel enjoyed the story. He enjoyed the last terrible page, because when he finished it, he realized for the first time what a memory he had. He looked at me proudly and told me back the story from memory, and I cried inside my heart. I went away and cried to the Master of the universe, "What have you done to me? A mind like this I need for a son? A heart I need for a son. A soul I need for a son. Compassion I want from my son. Righteousness, mercy, strength to suffer and carry pain, that I want from my son, not a mind without a soul." Reb Saunders paused and took a deep, trembling breath. I tried to swallow. My mouth was sand-dry. Danny sat with his right hand over his eyes, his glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was crying silently, his shoulders quivering. Reb Saunders did not look at him. "My brother was like my Daniel," he went on quietly. "What a mind he had, what a mind. But he was also not like my Daniel. My Daniel, thank God, is healthy. But for many, many years, my brother was ill. His mind burned with hunger for knowledge. But for many years, his body was wasted with disease. And so my father did not raise him as he raised me. When he was well enough to go off to a yeshiva to study, it was too late. I was only a child when he left to study in Odessa, but I still remember what he was able to do with his mind. But it was a cold mind, Reuben, almost cruel, untouched by his soul. It was proud, haughty, impatient with less brilliant minds, grasping in its search for knowledge the way a conqueror grasps for power. It could not understand pain. It was indifferent to and impatient with suffering. It was even impatient with the illness of its own body. I never saw my brother again after he left for the yeshiva. He came under the influence of a maskil in Odessa and went away to France, where he became a great mathematician and taught in a university. He died in a gas chamber in Auschwitz. I learned of it 4 years ago. He was a Jew when he died, not an observer of the commandments, but not a convert, thank God. I would like to believe that before he died he learned how much suffering there is in this world. I hope so. It will have redeemed his soul. Reuben, Listen to what I am going to tell you now, and remember it. You are a man, but it will be years before you understand my words. Perhaps you will never understand them, but hear me out and have patience. When I was very young, my father, may he rest in peace, began to wake me in the middle of the night, just so I would cry. I was a child, but he would wake me and tell me stories of the destruction of Jerusalem and the sufferings of the people of Israel, and I would cry. For years he did this. Once he took me to visit a hospital. Ah, what an experience that was. And often he took me to visit the poor, the beggars, to listen to them talk. My father himself never talked to me, except when we studied together. He taught me with silence. He taught me to look into myself, to find my own strength, to walk around inside myself in company with my soul. When his people would ask him why he was so silent with his son, he would say to them that he did not like to talk. Words are cruel. Words play tricks. They distort what is in the heart. They conceal the heart. The heart speaks through silence. One learns of the pain of others by suffering one's own pain, he would say, by turning inside oneself, by finding one's own soul. And it is important to know of pain, he said. It destroys our self-pride, our arrogance, our indifference toward others. It makes us aware of how frail and tiny we are, and of how much we must depend upon the Master of the universe. Only slowly, very slowly, did I begin to understand what he was saying. For years his silence bewildered and frightened me, though I always trusted him. I never hated him. And when I was old enough to understand, he told me that of all people, a tzaddik especially must know of pain. A tzaddik must know how to suffer for his people, he said. He must take their pain from them and carry it on his own shoulders. He must carry it always. He must grow old before his years. He must cry in his heart. He must always cry. Even when he dances and sings, he must cry for the sufferings of his people. You do not understand this, Reuben. I see from your eyes you do not understand this. But my Daniel understands it now. He understands it well. Reuben, I did not want my Daniel to become like my brother. May he rest in peace. Better I should have no son at all than to have a brilliant son who had no soul. I looked at my Daniel when he was 4 years old, and I said to myself, how will I teach his mind what it is to have a soul? How will I teach his mind to understand pain? How will I teach it to want to take on another person's suffering? How will I do this and not lose my son, my precious son, whom I love as I love the Master of the universe himself? How will I do this and not cause my son, God forbid, to abandon the Master of the universe and his commandments? How could I teach my son the way I was taught by my father and not drive him away from Torah? Because this is America, Reuben. This is not Europe. It is an open world here. Here there are libraries and books and schools. Here there are great universities that do not concern themselves with how many Jewish students they have. I did not want to drive my son away from God, but I did not want him to grow up a mind without a soul. I knew already when he was a boy that I could not prevent his mind from going to the world for knowledge. I knew in my heart that it might prevent him from taking my place, but I had to prevent it from driving him away from the Master of the universe, and I had to make certain his soul would be the soul of a tzaddik, no matter what he did with his life. He closed his eyes and seemed to shrink into himself. His hands trembled. He was silent for a long time. Tears rolled slowly down alongside the bridge of his nose and disappeared into his beard. A shuddering sigh filled the room. Then he opened his eyes and stared down at the closed Talmud on the desk. Ah, what a price to pay. The years when he was a child, and I loved him, and talked with him, and held him under my tallis when I prayed. "Why do you cry, Father?" he asked me once under the tallis. "Because people are suffering," I told him. He could not understand. Ah, what it is to be a mind without a soul. What ugliness it is. Those were the years he learned to trust me and love me. And when he was older, the years I drew myself away from him. "Why have you stopped answering my questions, Father?" he asked me once. "You are old enough to look into your own soul for the answers," I told him. He laughed once and said, "That man is such an ignoramus, Father." I was angry. "Look into his soul," I said. "Stand inside his soul and see the world through his eyes. You will know the pain he feels because of his ignorance, and you will not laugh." He was bewildered and hurt. The nightmares he began to have. But he learned to find answers for himself. He suffered and learned to listen to the suffering of others. In the silence between us, he began to hear the world crying. He stopped. A sigh came from his lips, a long, trembling sigh like a moan. Then he looked at me, his eyes moist with his own suffering. "Reuben, you and your father were a blessing to me. The Master of the universe sent you to my son. He sent you when my son was ready to rebel. He sent you to listen to my son's words. He sent you to be my closed eyes and my sealed ears. I looked at your soul, Reuben, not your mind. In your father's writings, I looked at his soul, not his mind. If you had not found the gematria mistake, Reuben, it would have made a difference? No. The gematria mistake only told me you had a good mind. But your soul I knew already. I knew it when my Daniel came home and told me he wanted to be your friend. Oh, you should have seen his eyes that day. You should have heard his voice. What an effort it was for him to talk to me. But he talked. I knew your soul, Reuben, before I knew your mind or your face. 1,000 times I have thanked the Master of the universe that he sent you and your father to my son. You think I was cruel? Yes, I see from your eyes that you think I was cruel to my Daniel. Perhaps. But he has learned. Let my Daniel become a psychologist. I know he wishes to become a psychologist. I do not see his books. I do not see the letters from the universities. I do not see his eyes. I do not hear his soul crying. Of course I know. For a long time I have known. Let my Daniel become a psychologist. I have no more fear now. All of his life he will be a tzaddik. He will be a tzaddik for the world. And the world needs a tzaddik. Reb Saunders stopped and looked slowly over at his son. Danny still sat with his hand over his eyes, his shoulders trembling. Reb Saunders looked at his son a long time. I had the feeling he was preparing himself for some gigantic effort, one that would completely drain what little strength he had left. Then he spoke his son's name. There was a silence. Reb Saunders spoke his son's name again. Danny took his hand away from his eyes and looked at his father. "Daniel," Reb Saunders said, speaking almost in a whisper, "when you go away to study, you will shave off your beard and earlocks?" Danny stared at his father. His eyes were wet. He nodded his head slowly. Reb Saunders looked at him. "You will remain an observer of the commandments?" he asked softly. Danny nodded again. Reb Saunders sat back slowly in his chair, and from his lips came a soft, tremulous sigh. He was silent for a moment, his eyes wide, dark, brooding, gazing upon his son. He nodded his head once, as if in final acknowledgment of his tortured victory. Then he looked back at me, and his voice was gentle as he spoke. "Reuben, I ask you to forgive me. My anger at your father's Zionism. I read his speech. I found my own meaning for my brother's death, for the death of the 6 million. I found it in God's will, which I did not presume to understand. I did not find it in a Jewish state that does not follow God and his Torah. My brother, the others, they could not have died for such a state. Forgive me. Your father, it was too much, too much." His voice broke. He held himself tightly. His beard moved faintly with the trembling of his lips. "Daniel," he said brokenly, "forgive me for everything I have done. A wiser father may have done differently. I am not wise. He rose slowly, painfully to his feet. Today is the festival of freedom. There was a soft hint of bitterness in his voice. Today my Daniel is free. I must go. I am very tired. I must lie down. He walked heavily out of the room, his shoulders stooped, his face old and torn with pain. The door closed with a soft click. Then I sat and listened to Danny cry. He held his face in his hands, and his sobs tore apart the silence of the room and racked his body. I went over to him and put my hand on his shoulder and felt him trembling and crying. And then I was crying too, crying with Danny, silently, for his pain and for the years of his suffering, knowing that I loved him, and not knowing whether I hated or loved the long, anguished years of his life. He cried for a long time, and I left him in the chair and went to the window and listened to his sobs. The sun was low over the brownstones on the other side of the yard, and an ailanthus stood silhouetted against its golden rim, its budding branches forming a lace curtain through which the wind moved softly. I watched the sunset. The evening spread itself slowly across the sky. Later we walked through the streets. We walked for hours, saying nothing, and occasionally I saw him rub his eyes and heard him sigh. We walked past our synagogue, past the shops and houses, past the library where we had sat and read, walking in silence and saying more with that silence than with a lifetime of words. Late that night, I left Danny at his home and returned alone to the apartment. My father was in the kitchen, and there was a strange, brooding sadness on his face. I sat down, and he looked at me, his eyes somber behind their steel-rimmed spectacles, and I told him everything. When I was done, he was quiet for a very long time. Then he said softly, "A father has a right to raise his son in his own way, Reuben." "In that way, Abba?" "Yes, though I do not care for it at all." "What kind of way is that to raise a son?" "It is perhaps the only way to raise a tzaddik." "I'm glad I wasn't raised that way." "Reuben," my father said softly, "I did not have to raise you that way. I am not a tzaddik." During the morning service on the first Shabbat in June, Reb Saunders announced to the congregation his son's intention to study psychology. The announcement was greeted with shocked dismay. Danny was in the synagogue at the time, and all eyes turned to stare at him in astonishment, whereupon Reb Saunders further stated that this was his son's wish, that he, as a father, respected his son's soul and mind, in that order, according to what Danny later told me, that his son had every intention of remaining an observer of the commandments, and that, therefore, he felt compelled to give his son his blessing. The turmoil among Reb Saunders' followers that was caused by this announcement was considerable, but no one dared to challenge Reb Saunders' tacit transference of power to his younger son. After all, the tzaddiket was inherited, and the charisma went automatically from father to son, all sons. 2 days later, Reb Saunders withdrew his promise to the family of the girl Danny was supposed to marry. There had been some fuss over that, Danny told me afterward, but it had quieted down after a while. The reaction at Hirsch College, once the news of Reb Saunders' announcement was out, lasted all of about 2 or 3 days. The non-Hasidic students talked about it for a day or so, and then forgot it. The Hasidic students sulked, scowled, glowered, and then forgot it too. Everyone was busy with final examinations. That June, Danny and I were among the 78 students who were graduated from Hirsch College, to the accompaniment of numerous speeches, applause, honorary degrees, and family congratulations. Both of us had earned our degrees summa cum laude. Danny came over to our apartment one evening in September. He was moving into a room he had rented near Columbia, he said, and he wanted to say goodbye. His beard and earlocks were gone, and his face looked pale, but there was a light in his eyes that was almost blinding. My father smiled at him warmly. "Columbia is not so far," he said. "We will see you on Shabbat." Danny nodded, his eyes glowing, luminous. I asked him how his father had reacted when he had seen him without the beard and earlocks. He smiled sadly. "He's not happy about it. He said he almost doesn't recognize me." "He talked to you?" "Yes," Danny said quietly. "We talk now." There was a long, gentle silence. A cool breeze moved soundlessly through the open windows of the living room. Then my father leaned forward in his chair. "Danny," he said softly, "when you have a son of your own, will you raise him in silence?" Danny said nothing for a long time. Then his right hand rose slowly to the side of his face, and with his thumb and forefinger he gently caressed an imaginary earlock. "Yes," he said, "if I can't find another way." My father nodded, his eyes calm. Later I went down with Danny to the street. "You'll come over sometimes on a Saturday, and we'll study Talmud with my father?" he asked. "Of course," I said. We shook hands, and I watched him walk quickly away, tall, lean, bent forward with eagerness, and hungry for the future, his metal-capped shoes tapping against the sidewalk. Then he turned into Lee Avenue, and was gone. About the author. Born and raised in New York City, Dr. Chaim Potok was graduated from Yeshiva University in 1950 with a B.A. summa cum laude in English literature. He then received a rabbinic ordination in 1954 from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Dr. Potok was a member of the faculty of the University of Judaism in Los Angeles and spent a year in Israel completing his doctoral dissertation on philosophy. He received his doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania in 1965. He has written numerous articles, reviews, and stories, and in May 1966 he became the editor of the Jewish Publication Society of America. The Promise, a sequel to The Chosen, was published in 1969. His most recent work is the novel My Name is Asher Lev. This concludes the reading of The Chosen by Chaim Potok. This book was read by Dan Lazar.